She called him out in front of the entire class, expecting an easy win. But the more she pushed, the more she realized she had picked the wrong opponent. The lecture hall at Berkeley College of Political Science hummed with quiet chatter as students filtered in, settling into their seats. It was the kind of classroom that carried an air of prestige. High ceilings, walls lined with bookshelves, and a podium that had seen decades of fiery debates. Dr. Rebecca Langley, a tenured professor known for her sharp wit and progressive ideals, tapped her pen against the wooden podium, scanning the room with the confidence of someone who had won countless intellectual battles. She had built her reputation on dismantling conservative arguments, turning discussions into public lessons on social justice and economic equity. But today, she had her eyes set on a new challenge. At the back of the room, Barron Trump, the youngest son of the former president, sat with an air of quiet confidence. His presence in her class had been the subject of murmurs since the first day of the semester. Students whispered theories about why he was here. Was he trying to reshape his image? Was he just another privileged heir coasting through life? Or was he actually serious about political science? Dr. Langley had been patient, observing him, waiting for the right moment. Unlike most students who flinched under her probing questions, Barron didn't shrink away. He listened, took notes, occasionally smirked when she made what she thought was an unshakable point. And that smirk was enough to push her into action. She set her lecture notes aside and leaned forward, her voice slicing through the murmurs. "Before we begin today's topic on economic policy, let's address something interesting," she said, her tone measured but laced with something just short of condescension. "Mr. Trump, you've been rather quiet in my class. I assume you have thoughts. Why don't we hear them?" The room stilled. Students turned in their seats, eyes flicking between the professor and Barron. A challenge, clear as day. Barron exhaled slowly, then sat up a little straighter. His blue eyes met hers without a hint of hesitation. "Sure," he said, voice even. "What would you like to debate, Dr. Langley?" A few students chuckled, sensing the shift. He hadn't backed down. And Dr. Langley, seeing the door he had just opened, smiled. "Since we're discussing economic policy, let's talk about wealth distribution, the role of government in managing economic inequality." She folded her arms, expecting the usual defense of capitalism and trickle-down economics. She had taken down better-prepared opponents in television panels, written entire books on the subject. But Barron didn't flinch. He tilted his head slightly as if amused. "You mean the same system that funds institutions like this university? The same progressive policies that have widened the wealth gap under the guise of equity?" A few gasps rippled through the class. Even those who didn't agree with him had to admit he wasn't hesitating. Dr. Langley's smile tightened, but this was only the beginning. The tension in the room thickened, students shifting in their seats, sensing that something unusual was unfolding. Dr. Langley had started debates before, but never like this, never by singling out a student so publicly. She rested a hand on the podium and tilted her head, studying Barron as if he were an intriguing case study rather than a young man sitting in her class. "All right," she said, voice calm but edged with curiosity. "You seem confident. Tell us then, how exactly has progressive economic policy widened the wealth gap?" Barron took his time adjusting the cuff of his sleeve before answering. "The idea of government intervention to close income disparities sounds noble," he said, his voice steady. "But let's look at the data. The war on poverty started in the 1960s. We've spent trillions on social programs, yet wealth inequality has increased. Why? Because the government isn't solving poverty. It's managing it, keeping people dependent instead of giving them true mobility." A murmur rolled through the class. Some students frowned, others nodded. Dr. Langley smirked. "Ah, the classic welfare traps people argument. You're suggesting that without government programs, people would magically lift themselves out of poverty?" Barron shrugged. "Not magic, incentive. Look at how regulations crush small businesses, how high corporate taxes push jobs overseas, and how excessive social safety nets discourage personal responsibility. If you make self-sufficiency harder than dependency, what do you think happens?" A few students sat forward intrigued. Others crossed their arms, preparing to push back. Dr. Langley's fingers curled slightly over the podium, but she kept her smile intact. "And yet," she countered, "countries with stronger social safety nets, Scandinavian nations, for instance, have better quality of life, higher life expectancy, and lower crime rates. Surely you're not suggesting that government assistance is inherently bad? Barron leaned back in his chair, exuding the kind of quiet confidence that made people lean in just to hear what he would say next. The Scandinavian model works because their economies are market-driven, he pointed out. They tax the middle class heavily, not just the rich. They also have fewer regulations than the U.S. on businesses. So if you want to argue for a system like Denmark's, are you also willing to tell Americans they'll be paying over 50% of their income in taxes? Dr. Langley's smile faltered just slightly. She had expected broad ideological arguments, not specifics. A student in the front row turned to his friend. Damn, he came prepared. Dr. Langley's fingers drummed lightly on the podium. That's a clever way of framing it, Mr. Trump. But you're ignoring the moral obligation of a wealthy nation to support its vulnerable populations. Barron's expression didn't change. I'm not ignoring morality, Dr. Langley. I'm questioning what actually helps people versus what just makes certain politicians feel virtuous. The murmur in the room swelled. Some students exchanged nervous glances. Others watched with fascination. Dr. Langley straightened her posture, deciding to shift tactics. All right then, she said, her tone sharpening. Let's talk about privilege. You come from wealth. You've never had to struggle for basic necessities. Do you think your perspective might be a little out of touch? It was a calculated strike. Something personal. Something meant to put him on the defensive. But Barron didn't blink. Are you saying a person's background disqualifies them from understanding economic principles? His voice remained measured, unbothered. If that's the case, should wealthy liberal politicians also be dismissed when they advocate for social programs? Or does this standard only apply to people you disagree with? The silence in the room was thick. Dr. Langley's jaw tensed. She was used to rattling opponents, making them fumble. But Barron wasn't fumbling. He wasn't defensive. He was turning the argument back on her. And for the first time she felt a flicker of uncertainty. But she wasn't ready to back down yet. The room was silent. Not the kind of silence that comes from boredom, but the kind that signals something rare. A moment where everyone realizes they're witnessing something they won't forget. Dr. Langley wasn't used to this. She had expected Barron to fumble, to lean on tired talking points, to crumble under the weight of academic scrutiny. Instead, he was methodical, deliberate, and worst of all, he wasn't intimidated. She adjusted her posture, adopting a casual stance, as if the subtle shift in body language might reclaim the authority she felt slipping. Fine, she said, her voice controlled. Let's step away from economic theory for a moment. Let's talk about democracy itself. Would you agree that an educated, informed population is the foundation of a functioning democracy? Barron nodded slightly. Of course. Good. Then you must also agree that institutions like universities serve a critical role in shaping responsible citizens by providing them with the tools to recognize misinformation and make informed decisions. Barron knew where she was going with this. Universities should be places of learning, yes, he said. But are you suggesting that their role is to decide which viewpoints are valid and which aren't? Dr. Langley's lips pressed together. I'm suggesting, she said carefully, that when people, especially those in positions of power, spread falsehoods, it's not just irresponsible, it's dangerous. We have an obligation to protect students from misinformation. Barron tilted his head. She was walking straight into the argument he wanted. Define misinformation, he said simply. A few students turned to each other, smirking. They had seen this tactic before. Ask the opponent to define a vague term and watch them struggle. Dr. Langley hesitated just for a fraction of a second. Misinformation is deliberately spreading false or misleading information that undermines facts and reality. Barron nodded. So if someone presents a fact that contradicts a mainstream narrative, and it's later proven true, was it misinformation at the time or just inconvenient? Dr. Langley scoffed. That's a false equivalence. Is it? Barron raised an eyebrow. Because history is full of examples where the official truth turned out to be wrong. Galileo was branded a heretic for challenging the scientific consensus of his time. If universities back then had the power to protect students from misinformation, would we still believe the sun revolves around the earth? A murmur rippled through the room. Dr. Langley felt it, the subtle shift in energy, the realization that the conversation was slipping from her grasp. "That's an oversimplification," she said quickly. "We're not talking about centuries-old debates. We're talking about modern, real-world issues where bad information has real consequences. Take the pandemic, for example. Public trust in science was eroded because of reckless theories that had no basis in reality." Barron didn't flinch. "You mean like when officials said vaccines would prevent transmission, but later admitted they were wrong?" A few gasps. That one hit. Dr. Langley felt heat rise in her face. "That's not the same thing." "It is," Barron interjected. "Science evolves, which means what you call misinformation today might be accepted fact tomorrow. The problem is, once you give institutions the power to control what can and can't be said, who holds them accountable when they're wrong?" Silence. Dr. Langley felt the weight of every pair of eyes in the room. She glanced around, searching for a student, any student, who might jump in to defend her position. But none did. Some were clearly processing what had just been said. Others looked outright convinced. And that's when she knew she was losing. But she wasn't going to let it end like this, not yet. Dr. Langley's fingers curled against the edge of the podium. She had debated scholars, politicians, and even prominent conservative thinkers before, but never had she struggled like this. Barron wasn't just regurgitating talking points. He wasn't emotional, wasn't defensive. He was surgical. And worse, he was winning. She forced a tight smile. "All right," she said, exhaling lightly as if she wasn't rattled. "Let's move beyond theory and talk about impact. You argue that institutions shouldn't regulate discourse. But what happens when unchecked speech leads to real-world harm? Hate speech, radicalization, conspiracy theories, these aren't just abstract ideas. They influence people's actions." Barron nodded as if he had been waiting for this. "I agree that words have consequences," he said smoothly. "But suppressing speech has consequences too. When people aren't allowed to challenge ideas openly, it doesn't make those ideas disappear. It just drives them underground, where they grow unchecked and unchallenged." She pursed her lips. "So, you're saying we should allow dangerous rhetoric to spread freely?" "I'm saying that the solution to bad ideas isn't censorship, it's better arguments. Silencing people doesn't stop extremism, it fuels it." A few students nodded. Others were whispering to each other. She needed to shift the momentum. Dr. Langley decided to make it personal. "Tell me something, Barron," she said, tilting her head. "Do you really believe you would be making these same arguments if your last name weren't Trump? Or do you just feel the need to defend your father's legacy?" The room went still. Barron leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the desk. His expression remained neutral, but there was a slight flicker in his eyes, not anger. Precision. "That's an interesting tactic, Professor," he said. "If I were losing a debate, I might try to discredit my opponent personally instead of addressing their argument too." A sharp inhale from the class. Dr. Langley's smile didn't reach her eyes. "I'm not discrediting you. I'm asking if your perspective is shaped by privilege rather than experience." Barron didn't hesitate. "Let's talk about privilege then," he said, "because it sounds like you're implying that only certain people have the right to opinions on these issues. If I weren't a Trump, would my argument suddenly be valid to you?" The class was locked in. Some students looked stunned. Others were grinning, watching the professor scramble to hold her ground. Dr. Langley exhaled through her nose. He was flipping her strategy against her. "You have a platform most people don't," she pressed. "That comes with responsibility. People will listen to you simply because of your name, whether or not what you say is accurate. And that's exactly why I make sure my arguments stand on facts, not my last name," Barron shot back. "Notice how you haven't actually refuted anything I've said. You've just questioned whether I should be saying it at all." More whispers. A few students exchanged looks. She had walked right into that one. Dr. Langley's throat felt tight. This was getting out of control. She had planned to expose his weaknesses. Instead, she was the one looking defensive. She needed to end this. But the problem was, she had no exit. The air in the lecture hall felt charged. Dr. Langley could sense it, the moment when control slips through your fingers, when the room you once commanded no longer bends to your authority. She had spent years shaping debates, steering discussions, controlling the narrative. But now she was fighting to keep up. Her fingers gripped the edge of the podium. She needed to take back control. "All right, Barron," she said, forcing a light chuckle as if the debate hadn't shaken her. "You've certainly given us an interesting perspective, but let's set aside the theoretical for a moment. Let's talk about outcomes." She let the silence linger before continuing. "If we followed your logic, if we prioritized absolute free speech, minimal government intervention, and unchecked markets, who benefits?" She let the question hang in the air. "Because from where I stand, it sounds like the wealthy thrive while the working class struggles to keep up." Barron exhaled slowly, calm as ever. "If we follow your logic," he countered, "if we let the government decide what speech is acceptable, who gets what, and how much control they should have, who benefits?" She opened her mouth, but Barron kept going. "You talk about protecting people, but what happens when the people in power decide that protection means silencing their opposition? What happens when your side isn't the one making the rules anymore?" His words landed hard. A few students murmured in agreement. Others looked deep in thought. Dr. Langley felt something rare, something foreign. She was losing them. "I think we've entertained enough hypotheticals for today," she said quickly, trying to shift gears. "Let's open the floor. Class, what do we think? Are individual rights more important than collective responsibility?" For the first time, no one spoke. Not because they were afraid, but because they were thinking. Barron leaned back in his chair, hands folded in front of him. He knew what had just happened. Dr. Langley had tried to corner him. And instead, she was the one left scrambling. Her throat felt tight. She glanced at the clock. 3 minutes left. She took a breath. "Well," she said, "at the very least this has been a spirited discussion." A few students smirked. Others looked at Barron with something new in their eyes. Respect. Dr. Langley forced another smile. But inside? Inside, she knew. She had underestimated him. And she regretted it. But what she regretted most was that the class knew it too. Dr. Langley closed her laptop, signaling the end of class. No closing remarks. No final counter-argument. Just a tight-lipped smile and a glance at the clock as if she were eager to move on. But the students? They weren't moving. A few lingered, exchanging quiet conversations. Some approached Barron, not to argue but to ask him questions. Others sat in thought, staring at their notes as if seeing them in a new light. And Dr. Langley felt it. The shift in the room. For years, she had held this space as a place where she shaped young minds, where she guided them to the right conclusions. But today, she had lost something intangible: authority, respect, control, maybe all of them. She gathered her things quickly, avoiding eye contact as she made her way toward the door. But just as she reached it, she heard Barron's voice behind her, calm, measured, unshaken. "Dr. Langley," he said. She turned, reluctant but unable to ignore him. "Thank you for the discussion," he said simply. "I enjoyed it." No sarcasm, no smugness, just genuine sincerity. Dr. Langley forced a nod, muttering something polite before stepping out into the hallway. The moment the door closed behind her, she let out a slow breath. She had thought today would be an easy win. Instead, she had walked into a debate expecting to teach a lesson, only to realize she was the one being taught. We often go into debates believing we already have the answers. We assume intelligence is about proving others wrong, rather than listening to what they have to say. But true intellectual strength isn't found in winning arguments. It's found in having the humility to recognize when we've misjudged someone. Because sometimes the student isn't the one being taught. Sometimes it's the teacher who learns the hardest lesson of all. If this story made you think, share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever had a moment where your assumptions were challenged? Let's talk about it. And if you want more stories like this, subscribe for the next one. Because the best debates are the ones that change us.